Nice to see everyone signing on for our third session today on success factors. If you would, type your name and where you work in the chat, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. Andy, I love your picture. That's intriguing. Makes you want to go there, right? Out to that view. Welcome, Stephanie. Welcome, Sarah. Kylie. Just about one more minute. And we'll get started. People will continue to jump on. It's the view from your outhouse. Holy smokes. Nice outhouse. So I'll share my screen and get us started here. So my name's Tim Rusk. I'm the continue to be the newest member of the NAO training team. Super excited to be with you today for day 3 of our series with Scott Schaffer. And yeah, super excited to be here and look forward to our conversation. Um, there we go. We've seen this slide before. The mission of NAO is to strengthen um, nonprofit capacity all around the state. We're interested in strengthening your voice, leadership, and capacity with the ultimate goal of enriching the lives of all Oregonians. And we do this through capacity building uh, trainings like this one, and we also work in person. We do convenings, different conferences, and things like that. Advocacy programs, which include the policy labs that uh, one of our colleagues is working on right now, Philip. And then we also do it through membership programs. So discounts on background checks and other kind of collective benefits. And we're looking at an employer tool to help lower the cost of having employees in a back office. So we're early in that process, but that's one of the membership benefits we're working on. So you may have seen this before, but we continue to delay the end date for our capacity building survey or capacity survey. So this is a 5-state effort to collect trends and issues facing the nonprofit sector. Really hope that you'll take the time to fill out this survey and share it with your friends. Love to get good information about that. We don't often talk about the sponsor for this particular series, but the Ford Family Foundation is one of the sponsors for this particular program. And I wanted to take just a minute to remind people this is a 2-part series, Success Factors for Nonprofit Executive Directors. We're here in the spring in part 1, but there's a whole part 2 coming up that's going to happen in the summer and the fall. And the main focus of this series, there it is to do that, is to focus in on that first article that Scott has written. So best practices, fact or myth. But in this slide, I just wanted to remind people that Scott's been doing this a long time. He's been working in the field, both as staff and consultant, publishing papers, and he brings all of that to bear in this particular series. So it's awesome to spend time with you, Scott. This is a little detail from our website. You can take a look at it later, but it just describes what phase 2 is all about. Um, it is a requirement to attend or listen to the entire series of phase 1, so all 4 workshops. And then in the summer, you get some coaching, and the fall series promises to be really good. Scott just recently updated the content for these sessions and focus for them. So I think it's going to be really worthwhile. So the focus is kind of we learned a lot through these first 4 sessions. I think moving forward, it's around how you adapt and apply those in your organization. And Scott, do you want to say anything else right now, or you're going to hold till
Um,
later?
I'll comment it just a little bit later, but yes, thank you, Tim.
Perfect. That sounds good. So that's it for my introductory slides. Just a reminder, my colleague Natalia will be sending out a reminder for our next session, which also includes a link to the um, the slide deck you're going to see. There's a video recording of the session itself that you can look at later. We improved the mechanics of that link a little bit, so it should be a little bit easier to access. And with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tim, for that introduction. And we are in session 3 uh, of Success Factors for Nonprofit Executive Directors. And our topic today is management and governance. And we're somehow going to we're going to tackle both of those huge topics in the next hour. And so it'll be very interesting. And I've been looking forward to this one because I know that as an executive director, these were the things I was grappling with every day. Some of the other things you don't always think about, maybe we should think about more often, but these are things you can't avoid. And so, great topics. This is my consulting practice. You've seen that before. This is about the series. Tim has summarized that. Here we see the 4 sessions. We are in the 3rd of the 4th now. The next one is exactly 2 weeks from today, and so that'll be a nice opportunity to have some great discussion as well. So to follow up on what Tim was talking about, phase 2. Phase 2 is an opportunity to really dive deep and to identify the ways that you can apply these success factors in your organization. It'll be much more hands-on, and I think a great opportunity to folks to embrace some of these issues, go deeper, engage with peers, and also engage with NAO over the summer. So here are the topics. Tim did show these on his screen, but these will be the topics we'll go into in the 4 sessions. And I think very timely and relevant things for any senior manager of an organization. So keep that in mind. For today, we have three subsections to this session. We're going to start talking about management of internal operations and what are some of the best practices identified in the success factors study. Also, for anyone who might be joining for the first time, and the first session, if you want to see the video to that, goes into this in more detail. The success factor analysis process and the study that it's based on. Basically, it's a way to kind of check and validate our assumptions about what works in terms of leading and managing an organization. What are best practices that are backed up by some level of evidence? And so I won't go into that in detail, but the idea here is that the best practices that we've identified are based in some research that we've done with NAO. And so managing internal operations, quite a big topic, and so many pieces, so many moving parts. What are some of the best practices that we looked at many of them in the study, and there were a handful that surfaced as having high correlations with organizational success. So I think of management. It's part science and it's part art. And where there's science, that means that really we we know that there are well-established practices that work, and there's no need to reinvent them necessarily. That doesn't mean that folks aren't out there tweaking them and adjusting them and making them a little bit better. But in many respects, when something's established, we can accept that. The interesting challenge with management, though, is that so many things are an art where you cannot read a textbook to say, to tell me how do I navigate through the various personalities and the complex lives of all my employees, different styles, different methods people use to manage their time, to manage projects, to interact with clients. It's juggling these complexities that come when you put a bunch of human beings together. That we are complex, and so there really is an art there. So I think it's really, to be a great manager, the challenge is, I think, to internalize the science while becoming a skillful artist. Not being an artist around those things that are well established, but being an artist around those things that will always require flexibility and judgment, and those kinds of things that are unique to you, that you can bring to your job. And so I thought of a juggler. I think about, what is it like to manage an organization? And juggling, I don't juggle. I've never been drawn to things like that, but I understand that juggling itself is part science and part art. That there's a technique that any of us could learn, and then there are embellishments that a good juggler can put into it. It was surprisingly hard to find a photo like this that had more than just two balls in the air. I thought two balls in the air is not even close to being an executive director. So the juggler, to me, that's the metaphor of the day. And I'd like to ask you all a question. We're going to do our first poll. We have a bunch of polls today and a bunch of discussion topics as well. So this is going to be fun. I'm interested in knowing, has your top priority been in your internal operations of your organization over the past year? So if we could put that poll out there, and if you could quickly reply, here we're interested in your top priority, just one. So Tim, is that poll circulating?
I don't think it's circulating just yet. So
Yes, 1 second.
there we go.
Okay, we'll give it a moment.
And Scott, your focus here is on the internal operations as opposed to dealing with funding or
Yes,
program partners, things like that.
correct. Yeah, looking internally, managing your organization. Let's see what people think. So look at that list, and for the past year, so we're starting to get some results. And more than half of folks have voted. That's great. They're coming in. This is a horse race. This is like the Kentucky Derby. I understand that was a photo finish. I don't want to bias the results, but let's see if we can get a couple more responses. Okay. And yeah, what we're seeing here, I think you guys can't quite see the results yet, but we have a virtual tie for number one. Staff recruitment and onboarding and staff retention are vying for number one. And actually, there's one person who hasn't voted yet. You can put one of those over the top, or maybe you'll vote for something else. Improving service quality is a strong third on our list. So that's really interesting. Staffing, the big theme is staffing, and I'm not surprised, because every client that I've worked with for the past probably 2 years at this point has had that as a primary challenge, if not the primary challenge. So yeah, thank you thank you for weighing in there. And so some of these best practices do apply directly to staffing. So very interesting. So best practice number one, data orientation in management. This isn't necessarily the most exciting one. Like if there was a Netflix series called Data Orientation in Management, I don't know how high the viewership would be, but it is an important one, and it showed us we saw a significant difference between those successful nonprofits and the relatively unsuccessful nonprofits. Is that the successful ones tended to use data in program relationship management, in their administration of their operations, and in decision making. They tended to use data more, and it was a marked difference. Here are some examples in ways that we can use data, and we did look at program fundraising and administration, which of course includes finance. So what's the purpose of data? Well, data helps us get tangible information to make decisions. I don't think, I mean, data can be interesting in its own right, but it's really not meant to be interesting in its own right. It's meant to be very focused in how we can use it when we're collecting data as part of management. And so some of these elements are really strategic, but some of them are very tactical on a day-to-day basis, such as staff satisfaction data. We can collect information on how our staff feel about various aspects of their job and make decisions that might help improve our staff retention, might help us understand what our selling points are when we're recruiting, just to pick one. And of course, there's a lot of data opportunities in fundraising that I think many nonprofits have not yet fully utilized. I do think that organizations that work in social services and health, I think program data in those fields tends to be fairly advanced. So there's a lot of good data collection. But often, what I find often is that organizations, they might have the data somewhere, but they don't have the time or bandwidth to use it, to analyze it, and then to really engage around it. So part of it, I think, has to do with finding the capacity to use data, and then having the culture that reinforces the way we can apply it. But this is a really important success factor for organizations, and the difference was pretty stark, I think, between the two kind of poles in our distribution. We have another best practice: quality control systems. That sounds very businessy of a term, but when you think about it, every nonprofit organization and every one of your organizations we're doing work. You're delivering program, you're providing services, and whatever those services are, there are ways that we could describe high quality services and differentiate that from moderate or low quality services. So to what extent are organizations monitoring and ensuring that they are performing well in delivering their work? And also, where applicable, are they evaluating these systems relative to what the best practices are in their field? So, for example, if you're running a food bank, how are you performing? How well do your systems work to assure quality relative to what the best practices are in your field? So we looked into this in our research and did find that this was important, and perhaps that's self-explanatory, but I wanted to show you this cycle diagram again. You've seen this in the first two sessions, and I do come back to it a lot. And I think this, it kind of applies to both of those first two best practices. First of all, for data, this sort of shows where data fits into this. We collect data after we first identify a problem, then we ask questions. How well is this working? What are the outcomes, et cetera? And this can apply to our service delivery. This can apply to fundraising. It can apply to financial performance of the organization. It can even apply to things like our staff recruitment, staff support, all kinds of things. We identify the problem, we ask questions, we collect data, we analyze the data, and that informs decisions. So we make decisions, we take action, and then we let things work for a while and we revisit them. And so this cycle can give us, you can think of it as a cycle of continuous improvement, and data fits right into that as an important cog in the wheel. So another best practice, this one was hard to name because it didn't lend itself to a concise name, but basically, when you think of your staff as a group, do our staff, we can ask two questions. One is, do our staff have the right skill sets for their job in general? And also, do they have the ideal behavioral attributes collectively across staff groups to really get an organization humming? Because having great skills isn't enough. At least that was the theory. That was a hypothesis in posing this question, was that we expected to find, and we did find, that both skills and behavioral attributes are important. And so when organizations generally had this, showed that their attributes and skills of their staff fit their jobs well, they tended to do better than other organizations that did not. And so that's perhaps not terribly surprising, but I wanted to ask you this question. I hope that you'll share your quick thoughts in the chat window. So in your organization, do you seek job candidates primarily on their skills, or primarily on their professional qualifications, or their job experience, or their behavioral attributes, such as, for example, how well we think they'd fit into a team? So behavioral attributes like, just a positive attitude, great interest in engaging with clients or engaging with patrons, participants at events, those soft skills. So what are your primary considerations? Please share if you would.
We've got Matthew talking about soft skills primarily. Hard skills can be learned. Soft skills, not so much. Vanessa talks about job experience and behavioral attributes. Anyone can be taught the skills. Blosser Center talks about skill, behavioral attributes, and willingness to learn. A combination of job experience and skills get them through the first round. The second round is more about behavioral and vibes. Combination of all, but soft skills push people over the edge.
Yeah, I like that, and I agree. Have you ever heard the term learning organization? I actually haven't heard that term lately, but I think maybe was a little trendy a while back. And the idea that as an organization, we are constantly challenging ourselves to learn and develop. And if you have the behavioral attributes, those soft skills on staff of people that are excited about, developing new skills and developing our systems and improving, that's that's something you wouldn't necessarily capture just on a resume. And so, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, a couple more comments right along the same line from Josie and Lynn. And Noreen talks about sort of the same thing. You need to have a certain amount of skills, but soft skills are very important. Mike tries to look at a mix of these, but honestly, it's relatively difficult to accurately assess behavioral attributes in a job selection process. They tend to show up after people have been on your team a while.
Well, that gets to an interesting question, which is the interview process. Like how I, I've always I've always struggled a little bit with that. The way we select people for jobs, we look at their resumes, we talk to their references, but we interview them, and usually the interview is the most important piece of that. And maybe there are several interviews. Maybe you interview with a bunch of people, and I I have worried from time to time that my process that I had developed was designed to find the best interviewee. So,
Oh,
which is not what the job is. And so, sometimes people who just aren't very good in interviews, or maybe the interview style didn't suit them well. Sometimes they may not do well in the interview. And sometimes you do learn, oh, okay, this is what we wanted to know but couldn't find out during the interview process. Yeah,
another quick
I think
couple
that what
comments.
yeah,
Sorry.
no, go
Sarah
ahead, go ahead.
sucks. Sarah talks about our next hire needs to be someone with enough experience to add an actual skill set because a lot of what they do is focus on soft skills and personality. And then Noreen comments, and she's got 3 thumbs up to say it really depends on the position.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. Yeah, in some roles, there's really no substitute for skills. You have to have the skills of the job. So, and the art of management comes in managing behavior, group and individual behavior. So, yeah. So a fourth best practice, performance accountability clarity. This falls in the kind of the boring but important category. And so recently in recent years, I think pre-pandemic, this was already starting to happen, is that I'd read articles where people are publicly questioning whether performance reviews are worth it. I mean, nobody likes them. They start to feel forced and formal, and people don't like the process. Do we really need to do them? And some companies supposedly were changing their policy, but our study found that when employees had a consistently understood what the accountability standards were, and that those standards were applied across positions. The simplest way to do that, maybe the most straightforward way to do that, is to have a performance review system. But when it's really about accountability and understanding what the standards are, and then accountability means enforcing the standards, we did find that there was a significant difference between those organizations that really focused on this and those that did not. So that may or may not be surprising. I'm curious, by the way, another quick chat things. For those who do regular performance reviews, how often do you do them? And maybe why don't we skip that question? But the one I'm really interested in, how effective do you believe your performance reviews are overall? And maybe why don't we simplify it even more and say give it a between, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being they're incredibly effective and 1 being they're useless. How would you rate your performance review process? You seeing any responses there, Tim?
Not yet. There's a leftover comment. A book so good they can't ignore you talks about the shortcoming of interviews. Sounds like an interesting
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Noreen has one here. We have weekly check-ins by the time we get to the annual and mid-year performance. It's really just a summary of everything we've already been talking about for months. Craig gives it
Good.
a 3 when we remember to do them is the important
Yeah.
part. Lynn
Yeah, it's
gives
very
an
time consuming.
8 useful, but without regular weekly check-ins and activating excuse me, a performance improvement plan if someone is off track. Adrian says, I think it's sometimes more effective to have regular one-on-one chats. We have a 90-day annual
Fair enough.
formal review. Here's one. Kim says reviews are worthless, and instead we're now doing employee-led annual reflection about goals from the past in the coming year. Julie says we do them once a year, but but they could be more effective if the ratings were calibrated across job categories. Managers tend to rate employees too high, in my opinion, and avoid conflict. Josie
Yeah. Yeah,
gives
that
it a
one.
number 1. We're a new program and don't have a process yet. And that
Got it. Yeah.
relationship between a supervisor and professional development is ongoing and more effective than an annual review.
Yeah. I once had a manager reporting to me who had to do kind of end of term performance reviews of his staff, and he was relatively new and he was struggling to get buy-in, I think, and from the people he was supervising. He was kind of on the edge there. Are they with him or not? And his approach to doing the performance reviews was he just gave everyone the highest score. And it was kind of shocking. The staff were really angry because they felt disrespected because whatever they did, they got the same score. It was interesting. And he did not last much longer, unfortunately. That chapter did not have a follow-up. Just didn't work out. By the way, in this study, there were a lot of practices we found that were not correlated with success. And we looked at 35 factors overall, and only 17 of them showed significant correlations with success. So slightly more than half did not show high correlations. Most of those showed relatively small correlations, so we couldn't conclusively determine that they're related to success or associated with success. Here are the ones that had weekly correlated correlation values. So take a minute to look at those. And client centricity of service delivery meant the degree to which an organization was engaging its clients in the design or management of the service they were providing. Some of these, I looked at these and y'all admit they kind of, I felt a little deflated. I'd say, wait a minute, I worked so hard on making our operations really efficient, and now this study is telling me that didn't make a big difference. Yeah, some of these I was surprised by, but nonetheless, that's what research is. We don't go out to validate our pre-existing impressions or expectations. What do you think this is something to ponder. What do you think that last slide is telling us? That these things have weekly correlated correlations. And what it's actually telling us is not that these things aren't important or that successful organizations don't need to pay attention to these things. All it's telling us is that the less successful nonprofits and the more successful nonprofits looked relatively similar on these attributes. So it doesn't mean that that's the reason that a less successful organization was unsuccessful, that they focused on one of these things. But sometimes it just means we didn't see a big differential. It doesn't mean they're not important necessarily. So like staff training investment, that's the one I was probably most surprised by, because I would have thought at the very least the less successful organizations wouldn't have had much money available to invest in training. But this is what it showed. So in that case, I can't explain it.
This slide is surprising, I have to say personally, but also there's a question. Could you remind people how you define success? You have a couple of buckets
Yes,
that you looked at.
of course, yes. So yeah, we had a measurement for success, and it was a combination of three things. 50% of it was success in reaching, achieving mission results, and we had some ways to get at that. 30% was financial performance, and we had very specific metrics that went into that. And then the remaining 20% was growth over 5 years, program growth. And so it's a combination of those three things. And we looked for correlations based on how organizations rated on these various success factors. So anyway, it's interesting. I have another poll for you all as we continue to move through our program here. What are your primary challenges regarding your organization's staffing this year, since staffing was a big question? So if we could put up this poll, we have some choices there. And I'd love to get everyone's input.
Just as we wait for the slide to come up, or the poll to come up, which it'll come up in just a
Yeah.
minute. But so when you think about the contrasting, like there's weakly correlated, what's the corresponding slide that is strongly associated with success? Does that make sense?
I think so. So for primary challenges, the votes are coming in.
Oh, there it is. I see it. Sorry.
So yeah, we're getting a bunch of votes. We're past 50% now. And yeah, these results are interesting. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds while we get all the remaining results. We have 84%. And yeah, we're just about 100%. And here's what I'm seeing. Number one, 32% of folks picked finding qualified applicants and filling positions. And that's a very timely topic, not surprising. Wait, that was number two. I'm sorry. That number one, it scored even a little bit higher than that, ensuring that our compensation is competitive. So that is something I hear a lot about. In fact, I've been asked to do compensation analysis for a whole bunch of organizations over the past year or so. And managing and supervising staff to ensure high quality, that was pretty high too. And so yeah, very interesting. So compensation and finding applicants to fill positions, those were the two big ones. Thank you all for. Now that's a case where the research confirmed my hypothesis that I had. So that's always nice when that happens. Okay, so we're now going to switch gears. So we've talked a little bit about managing the organization, managing internal operations. Now let's talk about how we optimize governance of the organization. So if you're an executive director, I'm guessing that you've spent from time to time, you are thinking about the board and perhaps what the board does, how we manage the board, how we get the most from the board, those kinds of questions. But I looked for a concise statement of what is the role of the board. This is what the National Council of Nonprofits says. So you take a look at that. They're fiduciaries, so they have a duty to make sure the organization is doing things the right way and also pursuing the mission. So this is what National Council of Nonprofits says. I try to itemize the content into a list. So they are legally required to be stewards of the organization. So there's some legal responsibilities there for the board. Fiduciary governance, overseeing finances, making sure finances are managed responsibly. Strategic oversight, which is what's the direction the organization's going in. We talked about strategy a good bit in the first session. Something that was not in that definition, but I think is widely understood to be a role of the board, is hiring and evaluating the CEO. Then I have the next 5 bullets toward the bottom half of this slide. These are question marks in my mind, because I don't believe these are legally required roles in any way, but they are often viewed as appropriate roles for the board. One is support for fundraising, because I think if you look at, I'm going to go back a slide. If we look at this definition, it ends by saying making sure the nonprofit has adequate resources to advance its mission. I'm not sure that actually is the role of a board. It is widely considered to be an appropriate role, though, and I don't think it's a required role. But here's another interesting one: is doing work to ease the burden on staff. I know that in very small organizations, sometimes that's viewed as a role for the board, and I don't believe it actually is. It's certainly not a required role for the board. And then providing advice for staff, I know that I often valued the advice of board members and found that that was a nice way to engage some of them from time to time, is calling them and asking for advice. I even found that that was a way to engage them when I did not care about their advice. I'd ask them anyway. But regardless, I think that there is a lot of flexibility in addition to those required roles of the board. And we tried to look at a number of these elements in the study. But I'm interested in it. So this is our third of 3 polls. What would you like your board to do more of? So why don't you weigh in on this question, and let's see what people think. It'll give us a little bit of taking the temperature of boards. What would you like them to do more of? So the votes are rolling in here. We are above 50%, almost 100% now. And what are we seeing? We're seeing one runaway winner by a lot more than a nose, and it is actively supporting fundraising. So that is interesting, because I think that addresses a pain point, doesn't it? That, we need resources to do what we do. And if the board can help on that, we'd love for them to do it. And we have a strong second place finisher, which is doing strategic thinking. So thinking big picture. I think that's very appropriate for a board. The boards tend to get sucked into the details, and doing more strategic thinking, that can be a great way not just to help the organization, but also to enrich the role of being a board member. So, so the third place was attending events and interacting with supporters, which I think is a great role for volunteers generally. And attending meetings, that didn't, so the other 3 were substantially lower. Providing advice and support to staff, 6%. So Don't do any more of that. So yeah, very good, very good. Thank you for weighing in there. So when we think about the board, we actually, this is one of the interesting findings in the study. We were looking at best practices, but we actually found some worst practices. And the worst of the worst practices was an interesting one. We had a negative correlation, a significant negative correlation, and it was the board's role in decision making. So we looked at the degree of board involvement in leadership level decision making in the organization. And the more the board was involved in these type of decisions, the less successful the organization was, and vice versa. Now, there are degrees to this. Like the optimal role of the board wasn't that they were completely disengaged, but the upshot of this, and one way to interpret this, is that a disengaged board is far from the worst problem. The worst problem was a really engaged board. So I'm curious what folks think about that. Is that surprising to you? It was interesting that this
could you give some more examples? Sorry to interrupt you, but could you give some more examples? People are asking for more specifics in the chat.
What do you? Yeah. Well, when the board is making all the decisions, when the board takes on the role of, well, I guess micromanagement would be the kind of the classic version of this, but when the board is trying to approve every staff hire, when the board is actually in effect supervising, and I'm not even the board as a whole, individual board members sometimes play a supervisory type role with individual staff, where the board is getting involved in what event are we going to do and are we not going to do, what will the content be of our exhibits for an arts organization, meddling in the program design or program management. There are lots of examples here. And so I call that, what I just described, I call the over-engaged board. And usually they are too much in the weeds, and usually they have boundary issues. They're doing the work that should be done by staff. And if you look at that definition of what the board's role is supposed to be, it does not say in there the board is supposed to be micromanaging the staff or micromanaging the organization's work. Now, you can argue there's an exception, which is an organization that has no staff. But even there, I think there can be boundary issues of, who's doing what. So what's your lane? What's the board's lane, and how do we get them to stay there? I think it is a question to ponder. I think we just basically, with your question, Tim, we more or less answered it. It's a problem because it just can interfere with the staff trying to do the work. The staff do almost all the work for most nonprofits. And if the board is out there trying to find stuff to do, and they're doing stuff the staff are supposed to do, or they're complicating the life of the staff, it's not necessarily helpful.
Mike or Scott, there's another comment from Julie just around how demoralizing it is. I mean, to have the board step in and do all that.
Yeah. And it is interesting that also this culturally tends to vary by the field that you're working in. It also, to an extent, varies by the size of the organization, but like it's less common to find a micromanaging board in a large nonprofit, but even there are variation. But culturally, some fields within the nonprofit sector tend to have more of an issue with overengaged boards, and it has to do with culturally kind of who tended to found organizations and what their roles are. You get into all kinds of interesting intercultural issues, and sometimes you even get like in this country we have mythology about not being a class-based society, but it is largely a myth because we do have stratifications. We just aren't comfortable talking about them or acknowledging them. So these things can come into play in board staff dynamics. And the gosh, I could talk about this all day because I think it's fascinating. I will go off for just one quick minute. There was a TV series that I think was actually a movie after that called Downton Abbey from England. It was from Edwardian England, and I don't know if anybody watched that at all. But they actually had in one or two of the seasons they had just a classic nonprofit merger. It was so pitch perfect. I just wanted to use that show in my if I could have excerpted in my merger workshop. But they also got into some of these class issues, and the traditional nonprofit, that's really where charities came from, was they had patrons, they had wealthy patrons, and that was the board. And you ever heard that term patronizing? I think that's kind of where that comes from, that idea. So that you can get into some interesting cultural issues and also just power issues. Who's my boss? Let's make. I'm looking at the clock now, and let's make this kind of a rhetorical question. But I'd like you to think about how you, as an executive director, can influence the focus of the board's attention. I think there are ways, and let's just think about that, and think about that for the next portion of our discussion. And keep that in mind. So how can we influence the board to focus on those things that are where they're really going to help the organization? But I'm interested, yes or no? If we could just confine it to yes or no for right now. Does your board evaluate its own effectiveness in some way? And I'm also curious, does it get input from outside the board? For example, does it ask the executive director's opinion of how effective you think the board is? Does it ask anyone else? What do you all think?
One person said yes and no. Someone
Yes
else,
to the first, no to the second.
someone else said, I don't believe so.
Yeah.
No, no.
And I think I'm not surprised to hear a bunch of no's because a lot of boards don't. It's not that they have any bad intentions; they just don't know what they're supposed to do. It's like sort of like, I had a friend who had a newborn child, and came home from the hospital and said, they don't come with an owner's manual. Like, I don't know what to do. And that's kind of like, being on a board, how do you know what we're supposed to do? Just kind of end up winging it a lot of the time. I want to mention an underrated role for nonprofit leaders, including the board, which is financial strategy. And if you remember we talked about those roles of a board, the required role, fiduciary governance, and this is where it meets strategic oversight, which is another really necessary role of the board. Financial strategy is a role where the board can really get involved, not be micromanaging, be supportive of the executive director, and really own some of the financial goals, which in turn might help them understand how are we getting involved in fundraising and otherwise ensuring the organization's well resourced. So we aren't going to have time to do more than just introduce these, but 4 of the best practices that we found, and these had very strong correlations. They were related to financial strategy. So we're not going to have time to go into all of them. And some of them might be self-explanatory, some of them probably not, but I'll go through them very briefly here. Diversity of revenue sources. We did find that the more diverse the revenue pie, if you think of a pie chart, the slices of the pie being different revenue streams, the more diverse the revenue streams were in general, the more successful the organization tended to be. So you don't want to rely on one big revenue stream. And that's an important part of financial strategy. The second one, this is one of the wonkiest names, intentionality of subsidies and profit centers. Wow, who came up with that? What this means is basically that nonprofits typically have activities that generate money, and they have activities that require a subsidy. And how intentional are those subsidies and profits? And for those organizations that did analysis and actually spent time thinking about it, they tended to be more successful than those who kind of, we have kind of a rough idea maybe, or maybe we have no idea at all. Those organizations, tended to not be as successful. The renewability of revenue sources, this is the, are these funders, are they likely to continue over time? It's like individual giving, and as an example. Also, a lot of fee-for-service income. These are highly renewable revenue sources. That was associated with success, another important part of financial strategy. And also those organizations that had a higher share of the revenue pie that was from major individual donors, those organizations tended to be more successful. So all of these things so come together in financial strategy, which I think is a great thing that boards can be involved in. And by the way, in phase 2 of this program in the fall, we're going to have a session devoted to financial strategy. So this is financial strategy is a process that can shed light on the organization's business model. And it's related to strategic planning, a way to work on the big picture. Let's also treat this as a rhetorical question. Think about, how can our board become more engaged in this? Are there activities, are there agenda items we can consider? And which takes us nicely to our third segment of this session of how do we apply these best practices? And I think we will have an opportunity for some more discussion here. With regard to management, I have some questions here that you can think about as a leader. What data do you need? What will it take to get the data you need? And then how can you apply it? How can you use it in a practical way? How do you evaluate your work? And how will you ensure continuous improvement? This is where we get to the quality control and quality control systems question. For HR, how do your HR management practices compared to the widely accepted standards? Now, I think there are differences between nonprofit culture and business culture, for sure. But a lot of the practices for HR tend to be the same, and they're practices that are designed to. Sometimes they're just designed to handle difficult situations well, and to prevent those situations from becoming bigger than they need to be and becoming distractions or even negative influences on the organization. So, but as you think about all of these things in management, if you think about where can we make some improvement in the direction of the best practices, what changes can you make this year? So we're not quite halfway through this year. Are there things that on a practical level we could incrementally implement during the coming year. And then similarly with governance, to ask a question, how does the board apply its efforts? Like, where you've got a limited amount of board energy that you can direct, or the board can direct, and how does it apply that energy? And what kind of recalibration could make the organization more effective? So can we recalibrate the board's work to make our overall organization more effective? And by the way, I want to emphasize a point that could be lost in passing, is that one finding, that worst practice finding of the overengaged board, just to make it clear that the disengaged board was not a major problem. It doesn't seem optimal, but I think that, if you would read the nonprofit literature, you might be led to think that the worst thing in the world would be having a board that just isn't very engaged. And that's just not true. There are a lot of successful organizations that didn't have very engaged boards. I think probably the optimal level was to have them engaged, but engaged in the right way. And so the second question is, how can you engage your board in big picture thinking? And I was glad to see that come out in the third poll, where a lot of folks felt the board should do more of this. So, how can we get more big picture thinking ideas on their agendas and then keep them out of the weeds? And then how can the board's work be aligned around themes like financial sustainability? Because that's obviously very important. It's very challenging for staff. And the more the board can own that, the more, in theory, the more helpful they can be. But if from a board member standpoint, so I've been on boards, and I bet a lot of you have too. You might sit on boards now, that often you rely on the staff to give us an idea of what are we supposed to do. And if the staff doesn't do that, then we will fill the vacuum in some way, and it might not be a great way. So we often look for direction from the executive director. Where do you think we should be spending our time and effort? So some of this might be a question of, how can you as a leader be more assertive in directing your board's work? So in a sense, you report to them, but in a practical sense, they also report to you, don't they? Because you're the expert in what's going on. They rely on you. And this is another way that you can influence them, by leveraging that role that you have. So I've just covered enough content that could easily cover several days of active discussion and workshops. And I know that there are some topics you'd love to discuss, because I know enough about your jobs to know that these hit some of your, everyday, or at least every month challenges. So let's have some discussion. Is there anything that strikes any of you? And Tim, do you think I think with our level here, maybe we can ask people to unmute and
Absolutely. It might be a good format to raise your hand, but then unmute and jump in.
yeah.
This is
And Tim,
discussion.
if you can, so I can't see all of I have the slides on my screen. I can't see all of the hands. So if you could call on folks, let's get some discussion going.
Perfect. Mike's first.
Scott, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between, I think one of the strongly correlated with success factors was diversity of revenue streams, but one that had weak or no relationship was new revenue sources. And it seemed, is there something sort of connecting those two? And can you talk more about it?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. So the one about new revenue sources. So that one, and Mike, you're reflecting back to, I think, one that came up in the first session, which was a I think it was a actual negative correlation, that when organizations had a strategic plan that emphasized getting new revenue sources that we haven't had before, those tended to be less successful organizations. And I think the lesson there was we want to start kind of like with political campaigns. You start with your base and you build on that. That when we're going for something new, and I've often been in strategic planning sessions where, well, here's this. I won't name names to incriminate anyone. There's one strategic planning session where the big idea that actually got a huge amount of discussion was, out of nowhere, one board member said we should start a brewery. This was an organization that had no connection to that field of work. They had no experience running a retail operation, or maybe no skills brewing beer even. But the board talked about that for over a half hour. And that would have been an example of an entirely new revenue source. And I think the idea is there that diversity is good, but it has to be kind of organic diversity that's built off of, brick by brick, and building that diverse pie. If you can find a new revenue source, that's great, but then focus on renewing that over time and then gradually turning it into a stable source. I think it's the instability of just kind of grasping at new revenue sources that might not be renewable.
Yeah, I mean, I think I offer an opinion also, is that too many revenue sources can be hard to sustain and to renew, and can be somewhat distracting. So I think there's a balance between diversity is good to an extent, but eventually it can be hard to sustain it because
I agree with you.
You're spread so.
Yeah. And so we did not test can you be too diverse in revenue streams? But I do know of someone who has written books on this subject of financial sustainability for nonprofits, who believes that having three significant revenue streams that account for 20% or more of your pie, your revenue pie, is the optimal number. Probably two is okay. You start getting into 4 or 5 significant ones, and you might be over diversifying, and it might be hard to renew. I agree with you, Mike. Any other questions or comments? You don't have to have a question. You might just have a comment of something that struck you while you were listening here.
I do have a question.
Adrian?
Oh, sir.
Yeah.
Hey,
Go ahead.
We were talking, one of the polls that we did was talking about, I don't remember exactly what the words were, but boosting staff morale. And that was a really popular response to that poll. I'm curious if you have any kind of data on best practices there, or if anybody else has had some success with that.
With boosting staff morale? I don't have any data about that. I guess I would put this to the group. Have you taken any type of action that you feel was successful in boosting staff morale in recent years? Or something that was unsuccessful? We can often learn from things like that.
Vanessa put in the chat quarterly outings, getting out of the building, or whatever that means if you're virtual. I don't know.
So yeah, the outings give people a chance to develop more, maybe more relaxed relationships with one another can build the team. Has anyone ever done a, I don't know if people do these anymore, and probably the pandemic took the wind out of this, but anyone ever done team building retreats with your staff? That used to be a thing. Have any experience with that? I don't know that they work, and I don't know if that's best practice. I'm just curious.
Yeah, Andy has a comment here like that. It's they have focused conversation and relationship building. And then there was another comment earlier around, well, if staff morale is low, why? Um,
Yeah, why is staff morale low? Is it the workload? Is it maybe the work conditions? Is it they don't have enough interaction with their supervisor, or maybe they don't like their supervisor? There are a lot of different potential reasons there. Here's a question for the group also. Does anyone here have an example of kind of I guess I would describe it as a cohesive management practice where managers get the same training and kind of a framework for here's how you do supervision, for example, or here's how you do project management. Does anyone have an example of something like that where you have intentionally are trying to develop a certain management style or approach? We have a hand raised, I think. Vanessa?
Yeah, the PEO that we're now using offers HR training, management training and such. And so I was able to bring along our director of programs and our facility and inventory manager who kind of co-lead, but we have had a lot of staffing changes over the last year as it's my first year in this role as executive director. And so wanting to just kind of make sure we're on the same page and we're learning together, we're speaking the same language, and really wanting them to see that, I want to invest in them as leaders and managers. And I'm growing in my development as well and kind of doing that together. So that's been helpful.
That's good. So a PEO like such as TriNet or Insperity, ADP, one of those types of organizations.
Yeah, and thankfully ours is very, very local to where we're at. So we could go there and do that.
Oh, very good. Very good. Yeah. So yeah, having common training also can help build team morale as well. It can build a common language, common set of skills, and build team morale. Also sends the message we're investing in our managers. Yeah, there's a lot there. Any last comments or questions? Is there one practice or best practice that strikes you as something that you can take back to your organization?
yeah, Scott, there's a lot of good comments in the chat, just around celebrating achievements when they happen, not getting overly focused on just what's the next goal, and doing some goal setting together. Yeah, there's a lot of good information in the chat. Love it.
Very good. Very good. Well, we are just about at our conclusion here. Here I have on the screen some things that actions you can consider taking back home after today. And but you can also come up with your own. I think these best practices, what we learned from this study isn't, we don't learn everything that we might want to know, but we learn enough about themes to maybe get us pointed in the right direction. I think that's the hope. And so the fourth session should be really really interesting as well. That's 2 weeks from today. And so in closing, I would just say thank you and appreciate everyone's engagement today. And I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. We'll have more time to discuss, ponder, and consider these issues and new ones next session.
Perfect, Scott. Thank you so much. And everyone, look for the reminder email that's going to be coming out. It'll remind you when the next session is. And it'll also have that follow-up information and a link to our SharePoint site. Scott, I love the list of things to focus on, and I love what not to focus on.
Yeah,
you can't just
often it's
add, can't just be
Yeah.
additive. Very good.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.